Okay, hey, this is Rory here, and I'm here with Michael Carter, the CEO of Finnrick. As you guys know, the company that is trying to disrupt the peptide industry. So, hey, Michael, welcome for joining us this morning.
Hey, great to be here. Thanks for hosting us, Rory.
Okay, well, let's jump right into it. Could you just give us a little bit of your background and then maybe tell us how Finnrick came to be? Like, who was behind it? What's the inspiration? And, like, what exactly is your guys' goal?
Yeah, sure. I'd love to. My background originally is engineering. So I was always very interested and still am and excited about coding. And so, I mean, I grew up coding and I coded through high school and coded through college. And so for me, it was just very natural to start working in Silicon Valley because, there it's like, I don't know if it's 90% coders, but it kind of feels like that, right? So I fit right in. And then it sort of shifted a little bit where like the reason I was excited about coding is because I just felt that I could do things. Like if I want to accomplish some goal, I could just build it. And I didn't have to ask anyone for permission. I could just say, huh, that's interesting. Let me make that for myself. And then that led to saying, oh, that's interesting. Let me make that, for other people. And then that naturally led into this idea of entrepreneurship because I came to think that actually like building companies at the point where you say, "Oh, I'm just going to start a company and go, try to bring a new product or service into the world," you don't really need to ask for permission. I mean, in some cases, there are some concerns, regulatory or whatever else. You got to follow the laws, right? But fundamentally, you get to just make something. And so I went from coding to entrepreneurship and started a few different companies and got a lot of experience. And so, that's my background. Um, in terms of Finrick and why Finrick, I have this belief, and I don't think it's that crazy. But the belief is just that I think if you fast forward like, I don't know, 5, 10, 20 years, I'm not sure exactly, but I think that the ability for AI to help us understand like our body, like our health, and help us make decisions will just be like crazy unprecedented. And you see the start of it, it'd be like science fiction. I mean, it already feels like that today, honestly, when you just talk to like GPT or similar. But the point is that, we have this concept of sovereign health or self-sovereign health, where it's that I'm going to take my own health into my own hands. And you were seeing more and more and more of that because people have joined interest groups, they follow podcasters, they in communities, they can search on Google for information. Now they can talk to GPT. So people are armed more and more and more with information. And this wasn't the case 100 years ago. 100 years ago, like doctors were sort of the gatekeepers of information. And so we just said, huh, if all these people are out there and they're making their own decisions, like what world does that look like? And so the biggest concern that we had, though, was that that's a really interesting trend, but then you look at the reality of today, and there's a lot of supplements and peptides and gray market or off-label sort of pharmaceuticals and this and that on the internet. It's kind of a wild west world out there. It's
Yeah.
very very hard to know like what's what, right? Um, and so we just said, okay, like the first order of business is just we need some kind of transparency. So we've got researchers or people or whatever buying these things. We need to just make sure that there's safety. And so that's it. We just said, let's just start with safety. Let's just test these things and publish the results. Like actually, it's really quite simple. We just buy them, test them, publish the results, or people send it to us. We test it, we publish the result, and it's pretty new. I will say, it seems like we've gotten a lot of feedback, a lot of very you know, passionate folks kind of on both sides with a lot of ideas, but people have noticed and they're paying attention, and I think it's helping people.
Okay. And so my first question that I have got to ask you guys, this is probably the number one thing that comes up. Are you guys working for the FDA or are you guys working for the pharmaceutical industry? Which one is it?
Yeah, so um, I don't even know anyone in the pharma industry or the FDA, much less, are we working for them? Absolutely not. So Finrick right now is, totally, I mean, we haven't, I mean, I'll be really honest. We haven't, and this is something that people are concerned about. We haven't yet sort of honed in on the like precise business model. Now we know where we're going. We've got a roadmap. And I think that gets to the heart of the question of like, well, how the heck do you even exist, right? Like, what's your business model? Who's funding you? But the short answer is it's not the FDA and it's not the pharma industry. I think we're 100% separate on our own little island with our own kind of mission. Um, but it's a valid question. But if anyone has any concern whatsoever, I can tell you 100% full blanket no. Like we're not involved with those folks.
So, and my next question though, because that's the second thing that comes up, I think people are looking at you guys are paying for these tests and they're looking like, well, that costs money. People don't do stuff for free. Could you just maybe sort of elaborate sort of how you see potential business models? In other words, where is the money coming from? How long is that money going to last? And when do you need to start returning a profit? And how is that going to look?
Yeah. So we're very transparent. So we put all of our investors actually on our website. And these are just people that myself and my co-founder Raf know in real life, people we've worked with or are friends with, right? And so um, these are just personal relationships. Now, it just so happens that some of them have a lot of experience investing in startups, right? Like that's my background, so that's my friend's background. But we raised, a relatively small amount of money, including, from myself, and so I've been lucky enough to be successful in past endeavors, so I can fund something like this. And the idea originally was, okay, well, let's get a transparent public testing company off the ground. And in order to do that, it just needs some initial funding, right? And so we're in a position where I'm happy to just fund it, kind of in phase one. Now, if phase one is just like, okay, subsidize it, and I and some of our backers will just pay for it, that's fine. That's phase one. And then if you look at, okay, but what is phase, I don't know, 9, 10, 11, 12, 20, like way in the future. In the future, we actually think there's something really big here where it's like, okay, how do you organize health on a global scale? How do you organize research on a global scale? And how do you organize supply chains on a global scale? That's thinking ahead really, really far. Like that's where Finnrick wants to be. Now, the question though is how do we get from where we are now, where I and our backers can fund this sort of indefinitely in this small stage where we are, but there's no way we have enough money to go and create kind of something to accelerate the pursuit of human health globally without having a business model in between. And so when we look at this market and think, okay, well, what is the right business model for peptides? Um, what we found is that number one, we want it to always be free for people who, anyone who wants to mail in a sample to make it free to test. Always be transparent.
Yeah.
We don't ever want it to be influenced by the vendors, meaning we don't want to ever accept their selection. And so the business model that we're rolling out that kind of fits all of these together that we think protects, the public and, sort of aligns interest is really, quite simple. So we're going to offer free testing for different people with samples from vendors up until a point, meaning we'll take, I don't know, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 samples per vendor per month, and that's free. And then, we'll sort of have a cutoff from our budget. If people want to, pay market prices, it'll be the same as everywhere else. But um, the real thing, though, is we think that the vendors who believe in safety will be willing to roll out a program where basically if somebody um, sends us a sample to be tested, they've agreed to reimburse them, right? And this is really, really, really important because what we don't want is the vendors are like paying for it or we need their permission or anything like that. What we want is like, look, anybody can go ahead and send us samples, and up to a point, we'll test them for free. But for certain vendors who are good actors, and by the way, it's open to all, but anyone who says, look, we're a good actor, we're willing to subsidize, anyone who makes an order from us will, if they go through the trouble of getting a test, we'll pay for it. And we think that that model then allows us to fund the tests themselves and our operations. It protects the customer because now they don't have to pay for it. But also, it's very important. It protects the selection criteria, meaning it's not like the vendor sends us some cherry-picked peptides where they just say, "Oh, here's the good batch. You test those," and then they sell, from a different supply chain. We only then accept the samples that came from the customer the ordinary way, right? And so we're actually testing the types of peptides that a customer would get in the mail in a normal way. And so anyway, that's the kind of intermediate plan. And we have other ideas and plans beyond that, but we think that's enough for us to be, at least break even, or at least not be spending so much money, if not profitable.
Okay. So and this might be hard for you guys to ask, but how big currently is the peptide market? And we're just going to talk about peptides because I'm going to assume that in the future you guys expand into supplements and other health things. But how big is it right now? Because it's kind of right now, it seems like it's sort of the Wild West with overseas vendors, US domestic vendors. How many people are using peptides, and how many people are going to be using peptides in, say, 10 years?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. And I think it's, fundamentally understanding how big is the peptide market. It's something where it always comes with a little bit of estimation, right? Because there's not like some public rubric that says it all, for all sorts of reasons. But fundamentally, this is a very large market, and it's large in part because you've got all these GLP-1s, but predating that, it was already a large and growing market. And what's so interesting about the peptide space is there's a lot of people who have been able to find peptides that are helpful and use them on a recurring basis, which are kind of in this vacuum where they live a little bit outside of um, like, you know, like a typical sort of FDA, trial circumstance. Meaning, if you look at like BPC 157, like we don't have phase three clinical trials of BPC 157, for X, Y, and Z. And in part, it's because it's sort of at this point, like the peptide itself, you can't really make money from it. Like if you went out and spent $100 million to do those clinical trials, approval, the next day the whole world could sell it. It's just a generic, right? It's not like patentable. And so there's 0% interest in anybody, actually running the FDA trial on BPC 157. Yet there's so much of this sort of anecdotal research and N of one research about its benefits. And so when you look at it and say, well, how many people have used BPC 157, it's millions and millions and millions. It's a very, very, sort of, it's not insignificant, right? We're talking in the US alone, like call it 0.5% of the population, which is a few million people, right? And then globally, it's a lot more, and that's just one peptide, right? That's just one, and there are many many others, and this is before we even get into like GLP-1s and others like
GLP-1
that.
is just, yeah.
And so the point is, I think that the peptide space, just back in the napkin, I think in the US, we're talking, low billions of dollars, maybe $10 billion a year. And that includes like domestic vendors and foreign, vendors as well. And that's kind of narrowly focused on peptides. I think it gets a lot bigger when you get into things like supplements or, steroids or whatever. I mean, there's just a much bigger world out there.
Okay. So, how are you guys planning to navigate the peptide? And it's called gray for a reason because it's sort of this in between, it's this in between medicine and other stuff. But how are you guys planning on navigating the legal gray area surrounding peptides? And also, along with that, probably one of the biggest fear in the peptide, world is that Finnrick is going to shine a spotlight inadvertently on this, and perhaps that's going to, get government actors or pharmaceutical companies be motivated to come and crack down. So, can you just talk about that for a second?
Yeah, absolutely. So look, first off, Finrec, to be very, very clear, you know, as a company and individually, we don't promote the use of peptides. We don't give medical advice. We don't sell peptides, none of that, right? And we don't sell them for research purposes. We don't sell them for personal purposes. Like we don't at all. And if you send us a sample, for example, we will test it and then we'll dispose of what's left. We won't send it back because we won't even return mail samples of peptides. We'll never put, a peptide in the mail and send it to anyone, right? So that's the first thing to be really, really clear about. And so, the question is like, okay, what is the legality of Finric, right? And how do we navigate that? Let's start there. And the truth is, there are different sets of laws depending on what you do. For us, we're actually doing research, right? Like what we're trying to do is understand and research the supply chain of peptides. And so for us to accept a peptide, run a test, and then publish it on our website, that's 100% like legal, free and clear, full stop. Now, beyond that, the question of, sort of, okay, um, but does this create, some sort of transparency in the market? I mean, the answer is yes. That's literally the defining purpose of Fenrick at this point in time is like let's create transparency in the market around the peptide supply chains so that people, researchers, individuals, whoever buying these understand what they're buying, right? Like that's the whole goal. And what comes with it, to your point, is okay. Well, that transparency, it's on the internet. It's a website. We can't install like some filter that says, hey, like only researchers here, no FDA, no big pharma. Like the point is, personally, we're very okay with that. Now, the reason is that I think there's an incredibly bad setup in the market today. And that setup is that everybody is sort of trying to hide, like all the vendors are sort of hiding or pretending to hide. I think the truth though is that it's very easy to find these vendors. It's very, very easy. You go on Google, you search, you go on Twitter, you join a Discord.
I,
You,
I have made that
you,
exact point when people talk about hiding, and I'm like, I'm not a very smart guy, and I was able to Google everything.
I mean, just to say, like, you can go. I mean, there's websites that index, not just peptides, like all manufacturers of all products, in China. You just go there. It's like here's the Chinese manufacturer site. You go on there and you can find, 100 wholesale Chinese vendors who will just mail you whatever peptides. I mean, and it takes about 5 minutes on Google. And the same is true anywhere else. And by the way, these folks are buying ads on like Instagram and they're buying ads on Google or Reddit or here and there, right? Sometimes they're not and sometimes they are. But the point is, there's this false sense of like, oh, look at this. We're protecting the vendors, from the FDA, which, by being, sort of, not transparent. But the truth is, it doesn't protect the vendors from the FDA. It only hurts the customers because this sort of facade of like, oh, hey, we can't be transparent, we got to hide, results in really terrible supply chains that can hurt people and cause real problems. So our view is like, look, we're aligned with the FDA actually in one regard. The FDA doesn't want people, poisoned and dying, right? And nor do we. Look, I don't know. Maybe I talked to a lot of people in the space who think that's a controversial statement. I don't think it is. I think the FDA generally was established, to protect the health of people. There's different opinions about it. We also are here to protect the health of kind of the world. And so from that perspective, bringing transparency into the supply chain is fundamentally a good thing. And the sort of net harm of it, of like, well, now vendors can get found out. Like, I don't think that really changed, at all.
Okay. So as you might know, this whole interview came about because um, I had questions about you guys use several different testing agencies, and I am familiar with some of the vendors that have been tested, and I'm like, I'm just not sure if I trusted the testing results. So I have sent in 4 vials of my own personal peptides, retatrutide, um, that I know exactly where they came from. These have been tested at 3 different levels: a vendor, COA, in a vendor paid testing group for the customer, similar to your guys' business model, and then customer paid. So I am 100% sure. And this was with Janashik, which is generally accepted to be one of the gold standards, whether you agree or not. Um, what what do you guys think about? Are you guys concerned that the ratings are going to be based on who's randomly selected to test whatever vials get sent in? And how can we get the testers to be more consistent?
Um, yeah, it's a great question. And I'm gonna, just answer simply first and then go into the details. But our approach is to use multiple vendors and correlate the results. Meaning, our goal is to be able to understand if something is wrong with one of the results of a testing agency, to to understand that because if we sent samples to like 2 or 3 different agencies, then it becomes more clear if two of them say, like, oh, hey, this looks, one way, and a third, sort of is the the minority report, so to speak, then we can look into it. But more fundamentally, here's what I'd say. I don't think you can build a business like Finnrick by trusting any kind of pillar in the space. Meaning, I don't think we can trust any of the vendors. I'm not saying there aren't trustworthy vendors. I'm just saying as a policy, we can't trust them. Our job is to not trust any vendor. I think that in order to protect customers, we can't trust any of the testing companies. Um, we can work with them, but we can't just either. And even in the longer term, I don't think we can trust individual customers. We can work with them, but a customer could send in something that's they relabel themselves, or it's like some sort of oppositional attack on Finric, or on the vendor they don't like, right? So the point is, there's a lot of different parties in this chain, and we have to find a way where we can't trust any of them. Yet we have to work with all of them and then publish credible results at the end, right? And so that's the challenge of Finrec, and that's what we set out to solve. And so the approach that we take here is, there's a few prongs to it, but fundamentally, the number one approach is just scale. As we scale up, these problems are easier to figure out. Meaning, if you have just like a handful of samples, and something goes wrong, it's hard to know. Was it one of five samples had some real problem with it because of the vendor? Is it one in five samples had some problem with it because of the testing company? Is it like one in five samples had a problem because you had some customer who sent you a fake sample? It's like you don't really know, right? But when you get to a certain scale, if you have 100 samples or you have 1,000 samples, then you start to look at it and you say, okay, when we segment it by testing company, 7 of 8 testing companies, this all comes back consistent, and one of them is off. And then you say, okay, this doesn't feel like a vendor problem, right? Or if you say, hey, we tested all of this and there's like a couple really bad results, they always seem to come from the same, customer sending it, or, whatever. It's then you say, huh, maybe, that's a one-off where you've got, something kind of going wrong there. Um, and so over time, though, I think we can roll out, sort of solutions that solve this even more. Like, for example, being able to allow, vendors have this problem. They always say, well, you're testing us, but what if, somebody sends in the wrong sample? And our, kind of answer to that is, we're working on a product which is for vendors and for customers around authenticity, where basically a vendor can use a key issued by us to sign that, basically create a little QR code on their shipment and send it to you. And all it says is like, hey, this was minted with a Finrite key. You can scan it and we can say, yeah, it actually came from that vendor, right? It's things like that where we can start trying to find ways to coordinate across the whole ecosystem. Now, to your point though, like, where are we right now? Are we ready to say like, hey, this vendor's bad and that testing group is bad? We don't really have any comments on it exactly, except to say that we're still somewhat early. We have over, 1,000 tests, and we've just had 1,000 customers, request tests, very, very recently with new samples. So sort of almost doubled our footprint, and we're growing, right? But I would say, this is the early days. Take everything you see right now with a somewhat, a bit of a grain of salt, because the numbers aren't yet at the level where I would say, hey, this is like scientifically rigorous to the point where, it's sort of like irrefutable. I think it's helpful, but in a few months, in a year, then it'll just be irrefutable.
Okay. So the next biggest thing that I see debated, and I am sure you are prepared for this, is the grading system. And I'm going to mainly overfill is a thing that comes up a lot because from the customer's point of view, overfill is good. I bought tirzepatide 20 milligrams and I get 25 milligrams. I've got an extra free 5 milligrams, but apparently you guys penalize for that. So could you talk about your grading system and then sort of concentrate on because purity, I think, is pretty simple. It's either pure or it's not pure, but um, the fill and then also the labeling.
Yeah. So the Finric grading system is, right now focused on um, purity and the like dosage, the amount in the bottle, overfill, underfill, or right on target. And then it's focused on batch labeling, and that's sort of for now. And then we intend to roll out additional factors, such as batch consistency, meaning your batch labels are actually correct. We can fingerprint them and say, oh, you're not just making up batches; these are real batches from real manufacturing runs. I think sterility is the big one, and endotoxins, right? So there's a lot more that we want to do. We're starting with just with these three, and some of it, is sort of a question of like costs, right? Meaning, it, like getting to sterility and kind of endotoxin testing at scale is sort of double the cost, or maybe triple the cost, right? And that's something where we're just not there yet. We're sort of brand new. We just launched, right? And so we need to kind of get to the point where we can actually fund that. But others, like for example, batch fingerprinting, knowing that when you put a batch number on, it's real and not kind of a made up batch number. Well, you can't even do that if no one puts a batch number on at all, right? So obviously we got to start with just did you put the number on the vial or not, and then later we can do the sort of fingerprinting. But the biggest criticism we get, that I see people say is actually not even true. The criticism is that we penalize overfill, and it's actually not true. What we do is we say, hey, if a vendor wants to overfill their bottle, like they're more than welcome to, and they just have to put that fill amount on one of five touch points. So they can put it on the bottle, but okay, that may be hard. So some people have said, oh, it's hard if they don't control their supply chain or, doing bespoke labels for bottle fine. They could put it with the shipment. They can put it in the email when you make a purchase. They can put it on the website when you check out, and they can post it in like a clearly identified way, sometimes like a COA. So they have many, many, many places they can post, what it is. It's like, hey, this is a 10 milligram retatrutide, but actually there's 13 in the bottle. And if they want to do that, right? If you think about it from a marketing perspective, if they want to say, look, when you buy 10 milligrams of retatrutide from us, you get 13, then that's fine. That's a totally valid strategy where if they want that to be sort of, their business model and customers are excited, then more power to everyone. The problem we have is really kind of fundamental. It's when they won't tell you that it's overfilled, um, and and they won't commit to how much is actually in the bottle because they don't know. And the reason this is a problem is because purity, like for a given batch, if I truly have 100 samples from the same batch and I test one of them and it comes back 99.9% pure, great. I test a second, I test a third, very, very, very quickly, that data can paint a picture about the whole batch, meaning it's really, really quick that, if those batch numbers are right, then, this is just a pure batch and it's good. However, the problem in this industry is that the amount on the label, like 5 milligrams, 10 milligrams, um, that unfortunately, most vendors are using hand-filled vials, right? Which is terrible, actually, but it's how the industry works. It's where they literally some researcher or compounder is spooning in the exact amount, putting on a scale and measuring it, and then sealing the vial, right? And so the issue here is that like they'll be like, okay, that feels good, and then it's 13 milligrams, and the next one they'll be like, okay, that feels good, it's 8 milligrams, right? And so the thing is, because each one is hand-filled, now the problem is if they don't have a certain operational soundness to that process, then they can't even tell you on their website. They can't say, "Oh, it's 13," because they don't even know. They think, "I don't know, maybe it's 13, maybe it's 8." And this is a huge, huge problem because if I buy two vials from the same batch and like it says 10, right? And I get back a 7.5, and then I get back a 15, but they both say 10, from one week to the next, the dosage just doubles. You think you're taking 2 milligrams, and you're like, this is the right dose, and the next week suddenly you're taking four, and you're like, what? I have all these symptoms. What's going on? And you have no way to know, right? And so our view is like, look, if you want to overfill, just label it. But our goal is to protect safety, and so from that perspective, we think this is a really important problem, and we also think it can be addressed and fixed. We think good vendors can just go fix it and either use a machine to fill the vials or have a better operation around the hand filling.
So just to clarify, so then if a vendor is providing a COA that is you can identify with that batch either from the labeling or from the vial, then you are going off that COA's amount for matching into that batch. So is that just a correct summary there?
Yeah, there's an asterisk there, but yes. Um, the thing I want to point out though, is that we will take that COA or that prompting. Like if the vendor is saying, "Hey, we put 13 in these vials, here's a COA," we'll do it. We'll take that as the baseline, right? And if you go on our website, it'll say that. It'll say amount on that the vial says. It'll say what the like they're prompting like the COA or whatever says and what the amount is. And if the vial says 10 and they've said, hey, this batch all has 13 and here's the COA, for example, this batch all has 13 and we get one and we test it and it has 13, then we say you get full points. You're not it's not overfill, right? And you can look on our website today. There are many, many examples of this. If you just look at the data, it's not hard. It takes about 1 minute, and you immediately find, oh, that's how it works in practice. And so a lot of vendors, though, they want something, to like when they get poor scores, they want something to blame. And the problem is they haven't actually said, oh, here's a COA or here's something where we actually have 13. They're just like, I got penalized for overfilling. It's not horrible. But there are some vendors who say, no, 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 we communicated that and then we didn't get penalized and it's fine. Now, I want to put an asterisk here, though, because there's something very important, which is, and this is something that people don't understand. Normal people don't understand this. I didn't understand this. I think very few people outside of like maybe the vendors and some of the testers really get this. And it's a critical point. A COA, it tells you, among other things, it tells you a purity and it tells you sort of how many milligrams are in the sample, right? So it says 99.9% pure and there are 13 milligrams here. And I talked about this before, but that COA, as it applies to the whole batch, it means that if one comes back with high purity, they should all come back with high purity, period, right? And so that's a
Correct.
great way that you can test for purity. If it says there's 13 milligrams on there, it does not mean that the whole batch has 13 milligrams, not even close, right? And so the point is a COA doesn't actually give you any kind of guarantee about how much is in your vial. And that's something people don't understand. They think, oh, the COA said 13, but the vial you actually get was hand filled by some other moment. It could be from the same batch, it could have the same purity, but it's a different amount. And so even though we will take the COA if the vendor wants us to, that doesn't necessarily mean that's actually what's in every one. And so if they then send us a vial that's 9, then they gotta be tested against 13 because they said 13 and now they get penalized for
See,
underfill.
I might actually disagree because the batch that I sent in has been tested, 9 different vials have been tested, 3 by each level, and it all came within half a milligram of being the same accurate. Now, it was one tester, and we could argue, well, that's just one tester, but you know, so I think there might be some sort of there's some vendors that are doing it correctly, some vendors that aren't doing correctly,
Well,
which
I'm not saying all vendors are doing it wrong. I agree with you. What I'm saying is if you buy from a vendor that uses a machine, they have these machines, they're not that expensive, that does the filling, like we don't know, okay? I don't know how they do it, but if they do it that way, then you're going to have a consistency.
yeah.
Every time you test it, it's going to, come back within zero point zero 0.01 milligrams or zero point 0.1 milligrams, and it's going to be consistent. And what I'm saying, the COA itself doesn't tell you. One COA doesn't tell you if it's consistent or not. You need 5 of them to understand what it's really filling at. And the problem is this belief that you can go off of the amount that's on one COA or 2 COAs is something vendors hide behind. And so a good vendor, it looks, it's consistent. A bad vendor, it won't be. And it's not sometimes because the so-called bad vendor has an ulterior motive, like they want to, have random amounts in the vial. It's because they don't control their supply chain. They buy from all these different places all over the world, and they're just relabeling it, and they don't know, and they don't understand what happened. And so our goal here is basically to force transparency and consistency. So you have access to 9 tests from one vendor. That's great, but we want the whole world to have access to 9 tests from every vendor, or 90 tests.
Okay. Um, so one of the things I saw after Raphael's interview with Chrissia is there was a fear that you guys were going to drive up prices because vendors now have to invest this money to sort of meet the Finnrick standards. I actually personally have the opposite view. I actually think you guys are going to drive down prices because you have recently started testing overseas vendors that are like a fraction of the cost. And if overseas vendors start passing the tests and people can see their name and say, okay, XYZ, Google it and say, oh, wow, that's like 1/10 the price. I kind of feel like you guys might start driving the price down. What is your take on it? Price up or price down?
To be honest, I don't have an opinion. I don't know. It's hard to guess here. What I would say is that, I can answer in part though. I can say that if the price goes up because vendors are being more consistent with their batching and with their dosing and their purity, then I think the market needs that anyway. Like the market, I don't want a market where there's a bunch of unsafe sort of compounds sold on the internet because everyone's trying to cut price there. I think they should learn how to cut price to have cheaper marketing and better operations, but not on the quality of the product. Um, the question of like, do we create competition? I think the answer is sort of yes, in the sense that we create competition around safety. And I think, a lot of folks, create these vendors that have this feeling of oh, they're safe. They create this brand safety. And what we do is we force everybody to deliver on that brand if, and actually be safe. And I think there's already been some surprising results where folks that may be new entrants or whatever and haven't built that like brand around safety get really good, test scores because they've actually done the hard work of making sure they own their supply chain and they're rigorous. And it surprises people, right? And I think, so you can see this go in kind of both ways. I think, you know, we don't really have intentionality here though, right? Like it's I don't know what's going to happen. I don't want to be out here saying, hey, our goal is to drive prices up and all the customers are pissed off, or our goal is to drive prices down and all the vendors are pissed off. I actually don't know what's going to happen. I just want everything to be safe.
Okay. Um, and here's another thing that coming up. When are you guys going to, right now, I believe you're only testing GLP-1s, Ozempic, tirzepatide and stuff. Are you and when are you going to expand it to other things? And I'm sort of concerned about bacteriostatic water, BAC water, because Eli Lilly, I believe, is starting to require prescriptions, making it harder to get. And a lot of these vendors are selling their own BAC water, which I personally don't trust. And I sort of see an area where you guys might actually be helpful in that. And then people also are concerned about like compound peptides. So can you talk about bacteriostatic water and other peptides and when you might start testing them?
Yeah, of course. So we don't test only GLP. First thing I'll say today, if you go to our list of products, we have a wide range. So if you go down the list,
Yeah.
there are GLP-1s. There's also BPC 157, CJC 1295, Melanin 10-2, PT 141, ipamorelin. There's Cimarelin, Tesamorelin, GHK-Cu, TB 500, right? So there's actually a bunch of non-GLP-1s on there already. And we actually intend to keep expanding the sort of catalog, so to speak. I think, we went from a phase where we were choosing what to test. That was kind of phase one, just bootstrap. Let's get some data, out there in public. And then we've now we have this sort of hybrid where we make some choices, but the customers just send them what they want. And so it's interesting. We're seeing people buying products that we weren't testing. Now we do because they send it to us, right? And so in that sense, we're letting the public decide what gets tested. Um, there is some practical considerations, meaning we have to operate at scale, and so there's like very specific types of tests that you use for different classes of compounds. And so peptides are somewhat uniform in that you can kind of test them all the same way. And so it's a natural place to start. And so our ambition is to be able to test anything. Now, when it comes to bacteriostatic water, I agree with you very strongly. I think that, everyone's running around wondering like, what's the purity of the peptide? And to the earlier point, it's like, you have to look at every weakest link in this chain, right? And people just say, oh, well, we've got the who's testing the peptides, who's selling the peptides, who mailed in the peptide sample. And then it's like now we feel good about that. We have lots of data and we figured out this is a really great peptide. And then no one stops and says, but I'm going to mix it with this water. And like, did anyone test that side of the equation?
Yeah.
And so in that sense, you're only as good as your weakest link. And I think it's an absolute fantastic point that, in today's market, the bacteriostatic water is, perhaps for some people a weak link that is problematic. And I've heard, and I don't know, I'm not sort of a specialist on bacteriostatic water, but I've heard that a lot of the types of like adverse allergic reactions and things like that can actually come from the water, not being what you expect, as opposed to The peptides, much less, sort of like much worse reactions, meaning if you expect it to have 0.9% benzyl alcohol and it has zero, and then you constitute a peptide, um, and then 6 weeks later you think it's still good, but actually it's had 6 weeks to grow bacteria. You could just be giving yourself a really really bad infection, right? And so there's actually like lots of problems with that. So our intention is to roll out testing for bacteriostatic water as well. We haven't 100% figured out our protocol for testing, meaning we know we want to test the percent of benzyl alcohol, right? That seems obvious. And I think if it's too high, it can cause irritation and problems like that. If it's too weak, it can degrade too fast and not stop bacteria. And so making sure that it actually is the 0.9%, I think we'd roll that out. But there's other things as well that we could consider, like endotoxin testing and sterility testing, things like that. So we're just finalizing that protocol, but strong agreement is a great point, and it's exactly the sort of thing a lot of people don't think about that you really need to be thinking about.
Will will you at any point be able to test multi-compound peptides like Clo and Glow, which are incredibly, incredibly popular, but it's made up of different things. I imagine it has difficulty testing. Any plans for that?
Yeah, so we can, and we have actually. Um, the 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 sort of two issues we see with them right now. Um, and so the first is this. I don't want to make any big pronouncements, but um, there's something about these kind of peptide mixtures that for vendors are far more difficult to get right than just like single compound. And I don't know exactly why, but you can imagine you have to kind of get the the sort of purity of two separate things right. You got to get the mixture right, the total amount right, right. And when you think about like, okay, do we have a problem of an industry where vials get filled by hand, for example, where it introduces problems like the wrong dosage. But by the way, if you have inconsistent dosage, it means it was mixed by hand, which also potentially increases the risk of contamination, right? But the point is, if you have these mixed compounds, it's much more likely they're mixed by hand, and just the scores just come back way lower. And so what I would say right now is that I think from a scoring perspective, we really need to figure out, what we want to do with the scoring there. Because if we were to come out with data on like the mixed compounds with our current scoring system, I think it'd be very, very hard for vendors to, get a reasonable rating. I think it'd be very hard. And our goal wasn't to come out with something where, just immediately everything has an F and, it's like nobody, can get any meaningful data from that. Our goal was to test something with meaningful reports where people can like improve. And so with that said, we do want to introduce, mixed compounds and have a protocol for it. But I guess I would just say that they're much harder to get right and, they're more expensive to test. And so we just said, look, let's figure this problem out once we've earned the trust of the public, and the vendors, and everyone, right? That we're who we say we are. Our mission is what we say it is, and we're here to do good in the world. Once we've kind of proven that to enough people, then I think we'll try to tackle the harder thing of mixed compounds.
Okay. And then two last questions. One will be a super easy one. Um, it seems like based on the other interviews, you guys were maybe a little bit, the observation was you guys were a little bit surprised or and maybe a little bit unprepared for the overseas market and its peculiarities, such as they label the packaging, they don't label the individual vials. What is your take on the individual markets there, and how are you going to handle sort of the differences between the US peptide and the overseas market?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So the first thing I'd say is this. Um, so we don't care if vials are individually labeled. I think in the long term we might start to care. Because I will just say, from my personal opinion, if you get 10 unlabeled vials, it leads to the potential for, problems in the future, right? Because you might mix things up, right? And so I'm just saying personally, like I think everything should be labeled. I think that'd be better for the whole world, right? But in terms of what Finnrick does today, if the shipment is labeled like kit labeling basically, then we consider that label for all the vials, right? So that's fine. Now the issue is that we need whoever sends the sample in, we need them to provide evidence of the kit labeling. If they just mail us a sample and there's no picture of the kit label or the kit label itself, then we have no way to verify that, right? So we will penalize in that case. And that may just be an education thing. Like it may be that we need to sort of tutorialize that better or explain it better to people. But fundamentally, we're not here to penalize overseas vendors in any fundamental way. Um, and so I think any overseas vendor, I think it's fine. I don't see a big difference in sort of how we would want to rank and how we want to test between the two. And I don't think that anything in our sort of rating system should penalize one over the other. I do think that you end up with some operational and communication issues that should not be hard to fix. If someone sends a kit and there's no label, for example, and they get a bad score, that's like the easiest. If they have 99.9% great purity and good customer service and everything else is fine, just on the next shipment, stick the label on the kit, and then now you're going to have an A rating, right? So even if there are any issues today, I think the overseas vendors should be able to be very competitive.
Okay. And then my final question. What is your personal experience with peptides? Can you tell me your stack or what you've used in the past? If you care not to, I fully understand, but just sort of give your personal experience with peptides.
Um, yeah, absolutely. So, I'll just say this. For me personally, I think what was so surprising and I didn't understand is how the regulatory industry, namely like the FDA, for the last 100 years, has shaped what people have access to. Meaning, if I go into any supermarket, I can buy like Tylenol, for example, among many other things, right? But then there's others that I need a doctor's prescription for, and there's others not even available. And I don't even think about it. Just like this is life. Here's how it works. And what was so astounding to me is that wait a second, there's this whole like class of drugs where many of them have never been brought to the market in a way that people even have a choice or doctors even have a choice. And the question is like, well, why is that? And in a lot of the cases, fundamentally, it's because the conventional thinking for the last like 30 or 40 years, when all this peptide discovery was happening, was like, okay, unless this is an injection for something really critical, then no one will ever take it. And so when they invented something that had to be injected, they said, like for example, melatonin 2, it's like, oh, it's a tanning agent. And they're like, that's cosmetic. No one's ever going to inject, right? And so they never ran the trials. And as a result, you have this medicine where, no one ever ran the trials, but it works. And no one ever will run the trials because there's no business model in it now. And they've just been stacking up over the last 40 years, right? And so when I sort of encountered this, I sort of know, okay, if I have a headache, maybe I go take Tylenol or ibuprofen. And, maybe if I'm really having a hard time sleeping on a trip, I can go, there's like some kind of, NyQuil or ZZ-Quil or whatever, I don't know, right? Like I have that in my head, but I didn't have this whole other class of things that have been accumulating for 40 years. And they almost it feels like weird. It feels like magic almost, like what the heck? No one told us. And then it makes you wonder, like, what the heck is going on? And so for me, that discovery of like, oh my God, there's dozens and dozens and dozens of life-changing peptides here that no one will tell you about and are scientifically and medically sound. Not all of them, but many of them, right? For me, that was just the journey that I found incredibly, illuminating and drew me to kind of Finrick.
So we can assume that you have used peptides before.
Yes. What I'll say,
Yeah.
going to too many details, is I actually had a very bad back injury right when I was like 20, 21. And, at the time, I had avoided surgery as much as I could. And it just became more and more debilitating. And, it's sort of one of these things where I couldn't even really walk, I couldn't even really sit. And I just graduated from college and I was sort of entering the world. And by the time it was finished after like a couple of years, literally of going through kind of treatment, I ended up with a seven-figure medical bill, literally, that I owed. And I didn't have a job, and I still was trying to recover from surgery and this and that. And it made me like never want to set foot in a hospital again. It made me never want to deal with the business side of medicine again. It sort of like made me not really want to play sports because this was a sports related injury like ever again. It sort of like really turned me off to it all. And I will say that I have looked into things like BPC 157, TB 500, KPV. That there's a whole class of these that's quite interesting. That I think had I known about it at that time probably would have inflected or changed, my treatment and maybe my whole life, right? And so I think that's like the most for me, the thing where like at that time I can tell you I didn't really care what, some scientist 1,000 miles away said or some regulatory, someone in Congress said or like that wasn't on the top of my mind. It's just like how do I deal with the pain and like can I walk again, right? Like that's sort of what's on my mind. And I was, willing at that time to look into alternatives to getting a surgery but they weren't really available and the knowledge wasn't available. Whereas today, sort of it is. And so that's where a lot of this interest comes from.
Okay, Michael. Well, I think our hour's up, so I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording here. But I just want to thank you on behalf of anyone who watches this for answering my questions.
Thanks a lot, Roy. Really appreciate it. Thanks for taking the time. I think it's great, for your followers and really the world at large.